We all know that money is important. You need money for everything. Food, water, electricity, housing, clothes, and entertainment. We use it every day, and without it, we'd be lost. But in spite of this, we don't often think about where it comes from. What if I told you that there's one agency that controls all the money in the United States, and that we can blame that same agency for financing wars, causing recessions, and draining your money of its value through inflation? Stop the printing presses. It's time for Project DOGE. Ever wonder how it is that the government spends so much money it doesn't have? What happens when they tax all they can tax and borrow all they can borrow? Well, if you worked as many hours as possible to increase your income and still ran up your credit cards beyond repayment, you would face bankruptcy, possibly losing the house and the car, everything. But the government, equally irresponsible, has a hack. They just print the money they need to keep the party raging. One of the most pressing concerns Americans face today, and a major factor in Donald Trump's electoral victory, is an explosion of high prices caused by runaway inflation. Every day it gets harder to put food on your table and gas in your tank as the value of your dollars continue to shrink. Some blame corporations, apparently believing that CEOs arbitrarily become more or less greedy depending on who is president. Obviously, that makes no sense.
They don't produce inflation for one simple reason. They do not own a printing press on which you can turn out green pieces of paper. The only such printing press is in Washington. I say printing press, of course, in the modern age we do it in a more sophisticated way.
That's right. The real culprit behind inflation is the Federal Reserve Bank of America, with the uniquely dangerous power to create money out of thin air.
We use bookkeepers and accountants and computers, but it comes down to the same thing. Inflation is made in Washington because only Washington can create money. And any other attribution to other groups of inflation is wrong. Consumers don't produce it. Producers don't produce it. The trade unions don't produce it. Foreign sheiks don't produce it. Oil imports don't produce it. What produces it is too much government spending and too much government creation of money and nothing else.
In 2008, Congressman Ron Paul popularized the phrase "end the Fed" as a rallying cry for sound money and financial stability.
There is no authority in the Constitution authorizing a central bank, which means there should be no Federal Reserve System.
End the Fed! End the Fed! End the Fed! Now that he has the ear of the Department of Government Efficiency, we may be closer than ever to seeing that dream become a reality. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to understand what the Fed is, what it does, how it creates inflation, and whether we really need it at all. The Federal Reserve System was created in 1913 during the Woodrow Wilson administration as a way to give the federal government more control over the money supply, which before that had been largely managed by state and private charters. Although the Fed is nominally an independent agency, supposedly insulated from political pressure, in practice, that's not the case. Shortly after its creation, the Fed played a major role in financing America's involvement in World War I. Even before the U.S. entered the war, the Fed's ability to increase the money supply at will permitted a rapid increase in military spending that would have otherwise been impossible. How exactly does the Fed create all this money out of thin air? By using a number of tools to control the amount of money in circulation, buying and selling bonds, issuing loans, and changing the interest rates it charges to other banks. When it wants to create more money, it lowers interest rates and lends out more cash. When it wants to tighten the reins, it raises interest rates and lends less. When the government needs money for a big project, like a war, the Fed can help finance it by buying treasury bonds and increasing the money supply. When the Fed was formed, this kind of money creation was limited by the gold standard. Every dollar had to be backed by a certain amount of physical gold. Without more gold, you couldn't create more money. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard once and for all, and since then, our dollars are not backed by anything. This means that the Fed's ability to expand the money supply is effectively limitless. Why doesn't the Fed just flood the country with money and make everyone a millionaire? Two reasons. The first is that since 1977, the Fed has been statutorily required to pursue a policy of maximum employment and stable prices. You can't have endless money creation and stable prices at the same time.
Know that the Fed has, by statute, a dual mandate, unemployment and stable prices. Are you saying that the Congress should repeal the unemployment mandate?
I would favor legislative reform. But in the meantime, it's had that dual mandate even as long as you have had Fed governors and even chairmen of the Federal Reserve in the past who have still understood the importance of dollar stability as an objective. I mean, take Paul Volcker. He actually, was somebody who focused on stabilizing the dollar. I think that that's something that the right head of the Federal Reserve can take into account even without statutory change.
This brings me to the second reason, inflation. Inflation is commonly understood as a rise in prices, but that's not quite right. Prices can rise for all sorts of reasons unrelated to inflation, including higher consumer demand and shortages in labor or supplies. High prices are merely a symptom of inflation, which refers to an increase in the money supply caused by the central bank, in this case, the Federal Reserve. Why do prices go up when there's more money floating around? Because simply printing more dollars doesn't create more wealth, in the same way that cutting a pizza into more slices won't feed any more people. You need more dollars to buy the same things, just as you would need more of those small slices to feel full. The inflation we're experiencing now is bad, but it could get a lot worse. It could become hyperinflation. Yes, that's a thing. History is littered with examples of countries running headlong into financial ruin via hyperinflation. When spending gets out of control and debts become too large to pay back, the temptation for the central bank to try to print its way out of trouble can lead to inflation spirals that utterly destroy a currency in a matter of months, weeks, or even days. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia's inflation rate reached 300 million%. In 2008, Zimbabwe reached an inflation rate of 79 billion%, with prices doubling every day. And in 1945, Hungary's prices were doubling every 15 hours. Without something like the gold standard to keep the growth of money in check, hyperinflation is a real possibility for countries that sink too deeply into debt or that try to finance endless government spending. Does that sound like anyone you know? The business cycle, the pattern of booms and busts that causes so much pain and suffering, is also caused by the Fed. Some people argue that recessions and depressions are a natural feature of complex economies that we just have to live with. But economists from the Austrian school, like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, offer a better explanation. The Austrians believe that the Federal Reserve plays a role in causing periodic recessions through its manipulation of interest rates and credit markets. It does this by creating false expectations among investors that lead to malinvestment. This is how it works. In a free market, low interest rates are a sign that times are good. People have more money than they would want to spend and deposit it in bank accounts, which drive rates down. When entrepreneurs see those low interest rates, they reason that it's a good time to take out a loan to start a new business or expand an existing one. In general, these calculations are likely to pay off because people actually have savings that they will one day want to spend on those new business ventures. When the Fed pushes interest rates down artificially, those savings don't exist. Businesses will respond to low interest rates by borrowing and expanding, but the rates no longer accurately signal the public's disposable income, and these investments are more likely to fail. When this happens across the entire economy at the same time, you get a recession. In response, the Fed makes the problem worse. Since recessions throw people out of work, the Fed's full employment mandate requires it to pump money into the economy in an attempt to stimulate spending. This causes interest rates to fall even lower, further distorting market signals.
And what is being offered by the Federal Reserve and Treasury and everybody in Washington? Lower interest rates. Well, lower interest rates is the problem. Artificially low interest rates is the artificial stimulus which causes the bubble, which allows the inevitable recession to come.
These policies only extend the recession and make the inevitable correction more painful than it needs to be. The Great Recession of 2008 is a relatively recent example of this, when the Fed kept interest rates near zero for years, delaying what should have been a fairly quick recovery.
And I think in the name of smoothing out business cycles, what we've seen is actually a Federal Reserve now that is contributing to financial crises, actually, rather than smoothing out the business cycle, they're exacerbating it.
Before the Federal Reserve, recessions still occasionally happened, but they tended to be much shorter, usually correcting within a couple months. Contrast this to the decade-long Great Depression, which many economists believe the Fed helped cause. What would it mean to actually end the Fed? There are different approaches that could be taken. Control of the currency could be returned to the states, as was the case prior to the Civil War. A system of free banking could be instituted in which private institutions could issue their own banknotes. We could embrace a system of competing currencies like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. Or we could simply return to a gold standard that would necessarily keep inflation in check and prevent the Fed from expanding credit too rapidly.
The point is to tie the hands of the federal government. That's the main objection. They say, oh, that causes the government to lose flexibility with respect to spending. I say, yes, that means you understand the proposal. That exactly is the point.
Vivek Ramaswamy has a modest but still powerful suggestion to replace the Fed's dual mandate with a single goal: keep the money supply stable and prices in check.
I think we have to restore dollar stability as the sole mandate of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Cut the playing God game, managing inflation and unemployment, trying to hit two targets with one arrow, disastrously missing both. Cut that game out. We're done with it.
At the very least, the DOGE should be looking at serious reforms to the agency, even if they don't go so far as to ending it outright.